This is the story of Inex-Adria Aviopromet Flight 1308. On the 1st of December 1981, McDonnell Douglas MD-81 was flying from Brinik Airport in Yugoslavia to Corsica, France. This was a charter flight. The MD-81 had 180 people on board. They planned on using a DC-9, but they switched to an MD-81 because there was just so many people. On that morning, the plane was full, so full that children had to share a seat. Since they would be flying back on the same day, the passengers did not have any luggage, and so they could fill the plane up to its maximum capacity and not worry about weight restrictions. After 7:40 a.m. in the morning, Flight 1308 lifted off from Brinik Airport bound for Corsica. As the plane flew over Italy, everyone on board was jubilant, and the pilots were busy with the approach checklist. They went over speeds that they would use for the approach. The approach to Corsica's airport was complex. They first had to fly towards the Alpha Juliet Oscar VOR. A VOR, or a VHF omnidirectional range, is a beacon that is used by pilots to navigate. Once at the VOR, they had to enter a holding pattern to lose some altitude. Once low enough, they'd fly a heading of 247 degrees. That is, the 247 radial of the Alpha Juliet Oscar VOR. They'd fly a heading of 247 degrees till they passed the extended centerline of the runway. Then they'd do a 320-degree left turn, finally lining up with the runway. For runway 03, they could come in straight in, but to land on runway 21, they'd have to get within visual range of the airport and then circle it and come in for a landing from the other side. That day, the plane cruised at 11,000 feet. The pilots got in touch with AJO Approach. Bonjour, AJO Adria 1308. We are level 110 approaching AJO VOR and further descent. The controller replied with, Juliet Papa 1308 AJO Approach, good morning. Number 1 in approach, you maintain 110 until you reach Alpha Juliet Oscar VOR. It will be for procedure from the VOR QNH 1009 QFE 1008. Surface wind is 280 degrees for 20 knots. Runway 21 in use. You will report over Alpha Juliet Oscar VOR and then descending over Alpha Juliet Oscar VOR. All of this was standard stuff. The controller was giving them the usual information on their landing, their altimeter settings, that sort of stuff. The controller asked the crew to report when they entered the holding pattern and when they left it so that he would have a mental image of where the plane was, because the controller did not have radar. But unknown to anyone, a critical misunderstanding had taken place. The controller never used the word cleared in his transmission. When a controller says cleared for approach, it means that you can fly the approach. But the controller did not say that. The pilots assumed that the controller would clear them to descend once they were at the Alpha Juliet Oscar VOR. But the controller had other ideas. He was under the impression that Flight 1308 would enter the holding pattern and descend because in his mind he had cleared them to fly the approach, and that meant that he had cleared them to descend. At 8:49 a.m., the plane was at the Alpha Juliet Oscar VOR. The captain said, in holding. The controller just replied with, Roger, report leaving Alpha Juliet Oscar on radial 247 for final approach. This is not what the captain was expecting to hear. He was expecting to hear something along the lines of, please enter the holding pattern, you're cleared to descend. But instead, the controller told them on what to do after they exited the holding pattern. The captain replied with, okay sir, we are just over the AJO VOR. We are requesting further descent. This is not what the controller expected to hear. The controller thought that the next transmission from Flight 1308 would be of them leaving the holding pattern on the 247 radial, not them asking clearance to descend. This is where a second misunderstanding took place. Pilots who were familiar with AJO took a shortcut. They would approach the Alpha Juliet Oscar VOR at a low altitude, and then they'd skip the holding pattern entirely. They'd just turn on to the 247 radial, and then they'd fly the approach. But the crew of Flight 1308 were new to this route. This was the first time that they were flying this route, and so they were following the approach down to the letter. So, when the crew radioed in asking for permission to descend a second time, the controller assumed that they'd be taking the shortcut like so many other pilots. The controller therefore said, 1308, you are cleared to descend 3000 QNH 1009 on the radial 247 Alpha Juliet Oscar and report leaving Alpha Juliet Oscar. The pilot replied with, Roger, will do. We are leaving 110 for 3000, radial 247 out of 110. At 8:50 a.m., the captain radioed, We are in holding over Ajaccio. Call you inbound on radial 247. The captain was sort of double-checking to make sure that the controller knew that they were in the holding pattern. But the controller replied with, Roger. So at this point, the crew were starting the holding pattern, while the controller thought that they would be skipping the holding pattern. 2 minutes later, they were at 6,000 feet, turning left to head back to the Alpha Juliet Oscar VOR. They said, rolling inbound out of 6,000. The pilots added, turning inbound to Ajaccio because right now we are in cloud. The controller replied with, Roger, 1308, report Charlie Tango on final. Surface wind 280 degrees, 20 knots. The controller thinks that they're making that final 320-degree turn to line up with the runway, and so he asked them to report when they were at the waypoint Charlie Tango. But this threw off the pilots. They were trying desperately to find Charlie Tango on the holding pattern. Nothing went by Charlie Tango on the holding pattern. As they passed 4,500 feet, the terrain system said, Terrain, terrain. The controller radioed to see if they wanted to land on runway 03 or runway 21. The pilots were inundated with information. Soon, the warning changed to pull up as a mountain loomed in front of them. The captain, suddenly realizing that the danger that they were in, called power, but it was too little, too late. The left wing of the plane slammed into Mount San Pietro. No one on board made it. The controller, unaware of what had happened, said, JP 1308, your position? JP 1308, your position? Concern turned to fear as he said, 1308, Ajaccio approach, what is your present position? But a reply would never come. A long list of misunderstandings had caused Flight 1308 to slam into Mount San Pietro. Right at the beginning, the controller omitted the word cleared in his transmission when he wanted them to enter the holding pattern and to descend. This gave the controller and the pilots two very different ideas of the situation. The controller thought that he had cleared them into the pattern, and the pilots thought that they would be cleared to descend when they reached the Alpha Juliet Oscar VOR. When the pilots asked permission to descend, the controller assumed that they were skipping the holding pattern altogether and cleared them to descend to 3,000 feet. The pilots, not knowing that there had been a misunderstanding, descended into mountainous terrain. But they still had opportunities to find their error. When the captain said, Roger, will do, we are leaving 11 for 3,000, radial 247 out of 110. The we are leaving 11 for 3,000 part was them telling the controller what they were doing at that time, which was descending. The radial 247 part of the transmission was them acknowledging the position where they would report their position. By mixing together these two types of radio calls, the controller got the impression that they were already flying away from the VOR out to sea. So with that, the plane was well on its way into the mountains of Corsica. But if you look at their approach charts, you can see that the minimum safe altitude for the holding pattern was clearly marked on the chart, and it was 6,800. So why did the crew decide to get down to 3,000? Listening to the CVR, they heard a voice that did not belong to the pilots, a voice that did not belong to an adult. One of the pilots had their son in the cockpit, and the child pointed out things that he saw from the cockpit in wonder, things like clouds and mountains. But these interruptions came at a very important time, their approach briefing. These interruptions from the child caused them to miss the minimum safe altitude part of their briefing. Another opportunity that they had to identify their error was when the pilot said, rolling inbound out of 6,000. This was said when they completed the outbound leg of the holding pattern and when they were turning left to head back to the Alpha Juliet Oscar VOR. But the controller did not know what the term rolling meant. The French controller was used to the term turning, and more importantly, the pilots did not specify where they were turning inbound to. The controller assumed that they were over the sea doing the 320-degree turn to head towards the airport, but no, they were actually in the mountains. Looking at the approach charts, you can see that Mount San Pedro is clearly marked at 4,587 feet, but the path shown on the chart goes nowhere near it. The holding pattern required you to fly straight for a minute and to then turn back in and then fly straight for another minute. But the charts were drawn under the impression that the plane was flying at 150 knots, but the accident plane was flying at 210 knots. This meant that the holding pattern of Flight 1308 was much wider and it would take them very close to San Pedro. But the pilots didn't really expect the mountain to be there because the chart made it seem like they'd missed the mountain by a lot. But one question still remains. Why didn't the crew react to the terrain warning? Right as the terrain warning started, the controller came on the frequency asking them if they wanted runway 21 or runway 3. This created a wall of information that the pilots had to assimilate that they were not ready to handle. This caused neither pilot to react for a few seconds as they tried to verify the authenticity of the warning. But by then, it was too late. Impact was inevitable. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. A big thank you to Admiral Cloudberg from Reddit for letting me use his amazing images on my video. He has an amazing article on this crash. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I'll catch you guys next time. Stay safe.